Hello and welcome to the Happy Musicians Podcast, where it's not about getting the gig, it's about enjoying it. My name is Tanner Guess, and I'm so honored to have you with me today. This is a great interview. I'm really excited about it. But before I set the stage, I do have 3 quick announcements. The first one being, I have a shop now. If you go to thehappymusicians.com/shop, I'm selling merch. I got t-shirts and hoodies and practice fuel mugs. And the minimalist in me has to point out that obviously buying a t-shirt isn't going to make you happy. But if you listen to this show and you're not my mom, it's because you want to be a happier, healthier, and more fulfilled musician. And I think our brand and the message it represents can be a powerful reminder of that in your life. They're also just comfortable and cute, and they're a great way to support the podcast and make it possible for me to keep making these episodes. Announcement number 2 is I'm on TikTok now. If you follow @thehappymusicians, you're gonna get some daily positivity and laughs and good times. I'm not a huge fan of TikTok, I'll be honest, but I care about this message and I wanna reach as many people as possible, and TikTok is gonna help me do that. And you can help it grow as well by following me on there and liking and commenting my posts so that other people see them more. And announcement number 3 is about Jen again. So, if you weren't here for last week's episode, I am incredibly honored and excited to be presenting a panel discussion on mental health and wellness at the upcoming Gen X conference. Jen will be January 6th through the 9th, and I'm presenting on January 8th from 6 to 6:50 p.m., and that's Eastern Time. I was a bit bummed that Jen wasn't in person, but there are actually some cool benefits to that. The main one being that since it's digital, you get access to all the clinics and you can watch them at any time. In person, if there were 2 clinics you wanted to go to at the same time, you either had to skip one or do the really awkward leave in the middle in front of your hero thing, and you know they're gonna comment it on it, and you're gonna have to give an awkward like, oh no, I really loved it, I just have to go to this one, and it's just terrible. And no one has to deal with that this year, and that's pretty awesome. Joining me on the panel are some incredible people. Matt Wilson, the great drummer, Chris Johnson, the trumpet player, and this week's guest, Sasha Berliner. Sasha is an incredible musician. She's a vibraphonist and drummer, an all-around percussionist, and she's an amazing composer and band leader. She regularly plays with incredible musicians like Tyshawn Sorey, Nicholas Payton, Warren Wolf, and Gerald Clayton, just to name a few. She's a graduate from the New School, and in 2020 she was named the Rising Star recipient in the vibraphone category, which at 21 makes her the youngest ever to receive the award, and she's the first woman to ever get it, which is pretty awesome. In our conversation, we talk about strengthening your connection with harmony, going beyond the numbers and the theory, and having an actual emotional connection to what you're playing. We talk about finding your voice, whether that's through some specific practices she talks about, or different technologies and relationships with your instrument. And we talk about what's been happening and how she sees the progress in the community in the 3 years since releasing her open letter to Ethan Iverson and the rest of jazz patriarchy. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you do too. Thank you for taking the time and attention to be here, and please help me welcome Sasha Berliner.
Got to the New School, and I tested out my proficiency requirements, so they were able to set me up with, basically lessons where I could choose who I wanted to work with.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, Stefan actually wasn't really giving private lessons. He was only giving them to one other student who had flown in from Austria to just to study with him. And he was, busy working at NYU and Rutgers. And then that was actually right around the time where he was about to get his job at MSM.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And that's, long story short, that's what ended up terminating our lessons, because he had exclusivity with MSM. But
okay, yeah.
Either way, he was not really teaching private lessons at the time, but I got a recommendation from Ambrose, the trumpet player, who's also from the Bay Area. I met him in high school, and he reached out to Stefan for me and said, hey, I've got this, vibraphonist from the Bay. She's coming to the New School. She really wants to study with you. And so he made an exception for me. But I do remember it was awesome. But the first lesson that I had, I remember he's introducing a lot of these harmonic concepts, and his whole idea is it's basically a system of superimposing triads, major triads and minor triads over a baseline chord, dominant seven. They're all seventh chords. So dominant seven, like sus7, minor major seven, half diminished seven, fully diminished seven, go through
Hmm.
all the seventh chords. Um, and it's not only to know what they are, but it's to be able to identify them purely by ear. So you could take two dominant chords that are really similar, maybe like dominant seven, flat nine, flat five versus dominant seven, flat nine, flat 13, or something like that,
Okay.
where it's just one extension that's different. And I would have to identify it by ear. So he played a bunch of these chords to me on the keyboard, and I was trying to identify them by ear, and I could identify maybe one or two, but the rest I was like, I don't know, to me, that before then, like, extensions were always just like numbers.
Hmm.
It's like different numbers. I knew how to find the numbers. I didn't understand the emotional relationship, that might, like, what is the emotional poignancy of a dominant 7/13 flat 9 chord? Like, I just didn't know. So I couldn't
Yeah.
really identify it by ear. I was like kind of trying and trying. He said, like, you should actually be able to do this by ear, like, no problem. You shouldn't have to think about it. And I played a little bit for him, just to show my improv skills. And he said, well, you have a lot of things to work on. And he was like, and then he even explained, you've got this one major thing missing from your playing, I feel like. And he said, next time this was like a 3-hour lesson. So um, we really went in on that first lesson, and
Hmm.
I was so nervous and I felt so embarrassed that, like, I didn't know everything he was talking about. And he was like, if you next time, if you don't come back and you haven't learned these things, like, I will not have the time and patience to teach you. And I was
Mm.
like, oh my God, Ark, okay. Yeah, like, I'll get on it.
Yeah.
And then
Well, and what was
but
the
it really
thing that he was like, you need to, was it like you had to be able to identify all these sounds by the time you showed up the next time?
I mean, yeah, and not all of them, but I think he was testing me on dominant seven chords in particular with
Okay.
major triads, and there's
Hmm.
maybe about seven of those chords.
Okay.
So I yeah, I had to learn that, and I had to learn his system of, the major triads over major seventh chords and minor seventh chords, I think, was what we started out with.
Hmm.
Um, Yeah, and I mean, it's not just as simple as like a C minor triad over a C minor seven. It gets way more involved than that. It's not very intuitive, like, when it comes to the more advanced harmony that he deals with. Um, so yeah, I mean, it definitely took work, but I worked on it, and the next time I came by, he was like, "Yeah, this is so much better." And then he continued to teach me from there, and I kept learning his system of harmony. Eventually he introduces minor triads superimposed over all those chords, and then you have to make these emotional relationships with certain chords that you hear. So
Yeah, that's the
he
thing
has
I'm
he
really interested in.
yeah. So I mean, it's hard to explain without playing it in front of me, or the instrument in front of me, but certain chords would be like, he would often associate them with, like, specific students he had or specific moments he had. He has this one chord, it's like a dominant seven, sharp nine, sharp five, and he calls it the Fernando chord. And I was like, why do you call it the Fernando chord? And he's like, oh, I had a student one time who said, oh, it's this chord feels like a Spanish soap opera, like Fernando. And I was like, what? But that was the Fernando chord, and then that's how we all knew the chord. It was Fernando, and then
Hmm.
um, I think I said, like, dominant 13 flat nine. That's like for me, that's like the neo soul chord, because I feel like any, like, Moonchild or Hiatus Coyote or any of those sort of um, neo soul groups, whenever they use a dominant seven chord, they always use that one. Or
Okay.
it's a dominant 7 chord that's often used in ballads because it has a really soft sound. It's
Mm.
not as aggressive as most dominant 7 chords. It is like a very precious sound, and so Stefan calls it like the baby chord. And I remember when we were going over his whatever his associations personally, I'm like, okay, the baby chord. And he's like, no, you have to do the motion too. And I was like, I have to do the motion. And he's like, yeah, that's how you do it. I remember being like, wow, is this an acting lesson? Like,
What is
but
this?
yeah, I mean, it was like that for all of the chords. And actually, instead of me being like, oh, that's the dominant 13 flat 9 chord, he would just have me do the movement whenever I heard the chord. And that
Mm.
was a way of getting it to be so intuitive that, like, you're not thinking about the numbers, you're not thinking about how it's written as much as you're thinking about the emotional impact of what what the chord is.
That's so
So that
cool.
was really cool, and eventually that really transformed my relationship with harmony because it didn't just become about theory or numbers. It became a bit about, like, not only emotions, but emotions spanning not just major and minor, happy or sad or whatever
Hmm.
is sort of the fundamental, like, explanation for how harmony makes you feel. It was like more than that.
Well,
Um,
I think it's awesome because like that's where I'm trying to get to right now. I feel like I know enough theory to where I can put a bunch of extended like harmony color chords together and write something
yeah,
that's cool, but I don't feel like I have any connection to it outside of like, well, I made that happen, I guess. But I'm really
exactly.
interested in that immediate connection to like there's so much focus on the what maybe, I feel like in school. It's like this
Yeah,
is what it is,
absolutely.
and this is about the why.
Yeah,
And that
yeah,
seems so
100%.
powerful. And maybe like more important. I like you can't have one without the other, but I don't necessarily know if there are other educators I know out there who have figured out a system to teach the why, you know?
I agree, yeah, and I think that's why it was so transformative, and I think ultimately that's what won him that position at MSM because he had a totally different approach,
Mhm.
not just to the administration aspect and representation and things like that, but because his approach was not something that I think other schools had really seen before. Yeah, asking that why, asking, like, another thing that Stefan really stressed that I feel like I hadn't really heard in jazz school was he really wanted everyone to bring out their own voice and everyone to tell their own story. He wasn't so hell bent on having you embody someone who came before you. I mean,
Mm.
obviously transcription and listening to the people who first did the music, that is crucial. Everyone should do that. But I do, I feel like my whole time in jazz education has been a lot of people telling me to sound like someone else or someone who existed before me. And Stefan, um, his whole thing was just you tell your story and
Mm.
not to be preoccupied with, like, sounding like someone who's already existed, who's already had a full discography. This is 2016 or whenever I was studying with him. You want to have us have your own contribution to the jazz world. You want to have your own voice. There's no reason why you should sound like someone who's already existed, and I'm going to give you the tools to make that happen. And I mean, yeah, again, it was crazy to me to see a teacher who was really like, everyone has a gift, and everyone, has the potential, the ability to bring out that gift. And that's what makes all of us be able to exist in the music world at the same time, even if there are other vibraphonists or other drummers. The fact that we all
Mhm.
have different things to say is the reason why we can all exist and all have work at the same time.
Yeah.
And yeah, that really had a big impact on me as well. And I think that's like a philosophy that I teach now, where
Mhm.
I never want to tell a student, like, oh, if you're not, a living embodiment of Lionel Hampton, like, what are you doing? It's like, learn that language, but I want you to be you. I'm not going to ask you to be someone else. What's the point of that? You're not someone else. Um, but yeah, you'd be surprised how many, jazz institutions are just bent on having their students sound like someone else. And I just, never really related to that idea, especially because I felt like my influences came from so many different places,
Mhm.
and that there weren't a lot of teachers that really understood that.
Yeah.
Because they just kind of want to hear bebop and straight ahead, and I wasn't really interested in writing music like that. Um,
That's
yeah,
interesting.
I'd say that much. But
Uh-huh. Did you find that you had the capacity, like, as a student to make those kinds of big decisions of, like, what do you wanna sound like? Like, how do you wanna be yourself? I guess I feel like sometimes you show up to school and you just aren't ready for that, and you need a teacher to kind of just give you a bunch of information, and then you can decide later, but did you feel like you had the capacity to do that, and that, like, the institution itself was there to support you for that journey? Or was it more like Stefan was doing this, and then as you were trying to be yourself, you had other professors and things that were like, "Yeah, where's your bebop at?"
yeah, I mean, I think that's how it was. I don't think it was like, I mean, sure, I could, play bebop lines if I wanted to. And
Mhm,
certainly sometimes it's like, all right, fine, I'll just do that thing. But I don't know. It wasn't who I was in terms
mhm,
of like what I want to contribute on the instrument.
yeah,
Um, and I mean, you listen to Stefan's playing; it's not what he does either.
mhm,
And he's considered one of the most like influential, vibraphonists today. And
yeah,
a lot of vibraphonists. Joe Locke also is not like a crazy bebop guy, but he's played with more traditional jazz artists, and it's really sort of helped him make a mark on the vibraphone world, especially everything he's done with like pickups and pedals and effects and stuff like that.
mhm,
Um, and that's the stuff that really ended up inspiring more than anything else. So
that's
um,
awesome.
kind of goes to show how effective that is, and
Mhm,
yet how many schools kind of neglect that idea.
for sure.
And I'm not saying that the whole school was against me by any means. I had a lot of really great teachers at the school. I had a lot of people who were really supportive of me, but I definitely had a couple of teachers who, wanted me to sound like someone who I wasn't.
Mm.
Um, and
I'm
not
curious.
just for the
Oh,
sake of like, learning or constructive criticism, but just out of like, they're out of touch with what's
mhm,
happening in the jazz world now because they haven't been active on the scene for 20 plus years, and they're not really involved in it. So they don't really know what's going on.
yeah, that's definitely very easy to happen in academia, I feel like, and
Yeah.
not to discredit, like, lifelong teachers, there's plenty that are great at it, but there is something to be said about educators who are also active players.
Yeah, yeah, those educators always inspired me way more. So, like, New School started embracing that more when they brought in adjunct faculty because a lot of them don't have master's degrees or PhDs or anything, but
So they
they are
can't be
working
good
on the
teachers.
scene. Yeah, right. Which is just, I never understood why you need a PhD to teach jazz. I don't know. That just, it seems almost counterintuitive to me. But
Hmm,
um yeah, those teachers always had the biggest impact on me because, yeah, maybe they were involved in a bit of academia, so they have formal training on in terms of how to lead a classroom, but they've actually gained their experience from working and continuing to work, and they were adjunct faculty because they couldn't always be there for class, and oftentimes they had to call subs because they were performing.
mhm,
But I didn't mind that sort of inconsistency. I mean, for me it was I the impact alone of these musicians being working musicians doing things that are you know new to the industry even after 100 years of it existing, is the most inspiring stuff. I In my last year, Mary Halverson was teaching and Nir Felder was teaching. They switched off for this one class, and that was like one of the best classes that I had because these are two guitarists who are doing such cool things on the New York scene and beyond, and they're involved in so many different genres. And Mary Halverson can go much more alternative, experimental,
mhm,
which I really like. And I mean, Nir's been involved in a bunch of stuff. I mean, it's just that kind of stuff was so inspiring. Or they'd be like, "Oh yeah, I'm coming back from I don't know, doing a session in LA with Dweezil Zappa," and I'm like, "That's so cool." Like
Yeah.
I feel like you would never get any of the like true professors at the new school saying
Hmm.
that they're doing stuff like that. Certainly, not now, and even 20 years ago, they may have not done
Hmm.
something like that. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I'm curious, and I may be revealing some naivety about the vibraphone here, but I
That's
feel like a big
okay.
part of learning, like growing as a musician and an artist and connecting with your instrument is finding your voice on that. And a lot of instruments like drums, you
Yeah.
can tune differently and do all these different things to change the fundamental sound. But like a vibraphone, at least the time I've spent on it, has like a somewhat of a fixed sound that you have to like work around. How do you go about connecting to like a fixed instrument in that way and finding your voice on it? Do you think it's different from other instruments, and what's your process been?
Yeah, I definitely think it's different. The vibraphone is tricky because it's like it's a true percussion instrument, even more so than piano in the sense that you're
Mhm.
using like an extension to play the instrument, like drums, but the extension is weighted more on one end than the other. So you can't just do everything you do on the drums on the vibraphone. It doesn't translate actually all the way. And not only that, you have the harmonic and the melodic aspects. So
Mhm.
it is really, I don't want to be like an instrument elitist here or anything, but vibraphone, I really do believe is one of the trickiest instruments for that reason.
Yeah.
And because there's so many things to be aware of and so many things to, um, you know, keep in mind when you're playing the instrument. Like another major hindrance is if you're sight reading on the vibraphone, you can't look where you're playing because you have to look at the page, right? So,
Mhm.
I mean, some people can kind of do an in between thing, but it's really hard, especially if things are moving fast. You kind of have to just know where the notes are on the vibraphone without looking at it. And it's tricky because it's way more specific. Your room for error is much greater on the vibraphone than like the drums or something where you
Mhm.
are doing the same thing of like placing an extension somewhere. At least piano or saxophone or any of those, you might be looking at the page, but your movement is just under your fingers right there. It's right
Right, you
there.
have that touch
It's not
connection, you
like
can tell.
a couple of feet to deal
Yeah.
with
Well,
playing.
and if you're not on your instrument too, like, I feel like vibraphones aren't as standardized as, like, a piano as far as spacing and things. I
It's
went in
true, yeah.
for I've done maybe 2 or 3 public vibraphone performances in my day, and they were by far the most stressful performances I ever
Yeah.
did. But because I had to like work up exactly what I was going to play because I didn't really have the freedom to express myself. So I
Yeah.
worked it all up and I was ready to go, and then I went in to perform for percussion masterclass. So it's like 60 percussionists just staring me down, and I get up there and the instrument, the keys were a little smaller and it had an extra like octave and a half, like or like half an octave or
Mm,
whatever below it. And it
yeah.
threw me so bad. Like I couldn't play anything because my just awareness on the instrument and my spatial recognition or my
Yeah, yeah.
muscle memory was just gone. And I was like, I need a different vibraphone, but I promise I can play this. Um,
Yeah, no, I mean, it's one thing to like have differently spaced bars, and it's another to have an octave extension or like an
mhm,
octave and a half because then your bottom octave is not the same as what it would be. It's not like just another lower F. It's like a C or something like that, and
mhm.
you're like, what? I'm used to reaching the bottom of the instrument and it being F. It's a standard vibraphone. So yeah, I that would throw me off too.
Like that was supposed to be a baby chord. What's happening?
Yeah. I've talked to a couple vibraphonists about sometimes playing shows, and when they have the rider or the backline, they're providing a vibraphone or something. And I usually play like a graduated vibraphone, which is to say the bars on the bottom are wider and longer and bigger than the bars at the top, which are smaller and thinner, and it
Mm,
kind of gets smaller as you go up.
okay.
And there are a lot of vibraphones where all the bars are the same length, height, width, everything. So like, and generally they're all pretty small. Like they don't have that. And the mallets that I have are made for graduated vibraphones. They actually are a little too big for like an ungraduated vibraphone.
Mm.
The bars are a little too small, and the spacing is completely different because on a graduated vibraphone, the lower range is farther apart than the upper range,
Mm-hmm.
where the notes are closer together because the bars are smaller. And so that kind of thing can totally throw you off. And um, there are even, a lot of vibraphonists, like if they normally play a graduated vibraphone and then they're given an ungraduated vibraphone, they'll say, I can't use this. I know that Steve Nelson did that exact same thing at Smalls. And from then on, they just had a graduated vibraphone.
Nice.
But I think they tried to give him an ungraduated vibraphone. And he was like, no, I didn't take it back.
Well, so
because it's a big deal.
Yeah. I mean, so there's a lot of just like technical challenges with the instrument. Like what has or like specific things you've done maybe to overcome that and just to like find your voice on like an instrument where like these pitches are fixed. Like that's what it sounds like when you hit it,
Yeah. You kind of have to find other ways to give the illusion that the pitches are not fixed. So things like flams or certain runs or certain roughs or things like that. I mean, those are drum terms really, but they can be applied to vibraphone. And it's just ways of making the notes not seem so stagnant and sort of giving them more breath. And that's also something I worked on a lot with Stefan. He always says, I'm trying to make my improvising voice sound like the human voice, but vibraphone doesn't sound like the human voice in the way that a saxophone does, or in the way that a trumpet does, where you have the influence of voice in it. Vibraphone does not have that. Yeah, again, it has fixed pitches, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
So he would often, he would put just a random text in front of me. It could be a book, it could be an article, whatever. And he says, so read this out loud. And while you're reading, the way we speak, it doesn't really fall into a time signature or a rhythm. And yet it's so natural to us, the way that we communicate, we don't even think about it. So he said, just read this as if you're reading it normally and try to embody the way that you just phrase your words or your conversations or your, how you're reading this on the instrument. So you're trying to, follow sort of the contour of the way that we speak sentences, which doesn't fall into time, which is not really like pre-designated or anything like that, but it is natural.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't think about it. And to get that to translate on the instrument is a way to sort of, it's like you're mimicking the way that the human voice is, as a means of conversation, as a means of singing, as a means of a number of things. And it was so hard to do that because you obviously, once you play, you want to put it into time, you want to put it into a rhythm, that but it's like when we speak, that's not actually what happens. So that was the challenge. But that kind of thing kind of gets you closer to the human voice. He often sings when he plays, and that's a habit that I've developed a little bit. And sometimes I'll record or something, and then I hear my voice, and I'm like, oh God, here I go again. But it's sort of a way of connecting the human voice to the instrument, which is not a very, it doesn't have that sort of voice influence that horn instruments often have, that anything that's technically not a percussion instrument.
Damn, that gets that's so deep though, because finding your voice is just one of those cliches you hear a lot. And we have this obsession with comparing jazz music or music in general to conversation or a language or whatever. But I don't feel like the comparison gets taken far enough. And that is so
totally
cool. He
agree.
went all the way on that. And that's so awesome. And it's almost like you're connecting with your own voice. Like, how do I speak? What is the way that I communicate that's natural to me? And
Exactly,
it
yeah.
does go to speak to what we talked about before, or what you were saying, that there's room for everyone to have their own voice, and that's what makes it so we can all have gigs and be ourselves,
Exactly.
because we all already do, right? We already speak our own way. We have our own diction and pacing and cadence that's
Totally,
unique
yeah.
to us, and accessing on your instrument. Okay, that's awesome.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
know what I'm
exactly.
working on this week. That's it.
Yeah, it's a good exercise. It's
Mhm.
really, really tricky, but, then you start to get somewhere with it.
And have you been I feel like I've seen you've been experimenting more with, like, pedals and things. Um
Yeah, so I think that's also become a big part of my voice on the instrument. I mean, it's not necessarily you can use it as a means of like improvisational interaction.
Mhm,
Sometimes you can get ideas from the pedals you're using, from the effects that you're using, and use that as a means to respond or come up with new ideas in the same way that you would respond to another band member or something like that when they contribute their ideas when they're comping or if they respond to your solo, that kind of thing. But I think some of it is also just sonic and looking for new textures on the vibraphone, looking for new sonic possibilities. And I was always interested in effects. I mean, I grew up with a lot of alternative rock music, stuff like that, so there's a lot of effects. My brother is a guitar player, so he was always using pedals, and I always thought it was really fascinating. And then once I um, saw Mike Maneri from Steps Ahead and Joe Locke using a pickup system with their vibraphone and even using some effects, I was like, oh my God, I have to do that.
mhm,
And I was also good friends with someone who used a lot of pedals in his work, and used it as like yeah, as sort of an improvisational tactic as well as just a means to like make himself stand out and be unique and one more tool to like be able to use on stage. And I was like,
mhm,
yeah, I got to do that. I'm super interested in that. And I spent a long time like saving up for the pickup system because it is a little expensive for the vibraphone, but then I finally got it, and I got some pedals, and I think it's totally transformed particularly my solo performance because I do a lot of loops and stuff like that. But I think it's also really influenced my albums and stuff like that, where I'm using a lot of effects, where I'm using it as, an atmospheric technique as a way to bring out certain phrases or certain arcs and things like that to emphasize certain parts. Um, and certainly to create atmosphere and texture is huge for me. I love stuff that really feels like it's full of layers of audio and atmosphere, not in an overwhelming way, but just in a textural way. And yeah, I don't know. I didn't want to just stick to the plain vibraphone sound or the motor sound with the vibrato. I was
mhm.
interested in trying something else. So that's kind of where that came from. And I'm still doing that, still involved in that. I really like it. But you definitely have to get the hang of it because um, there's only two ways to control the pedals, which is like one, you control it with your hands, which means you give up one of your hands playing the vibraphone to do that.
Mhm.
So I've had to learn some techniques that I can just do in one hand, like rolling, things like that,
Yeah.
to, you know, whereas with like one mallet or something, if you just play one note, it's like, oh, what are you going to do when you're tweaking the note? And,
Mhm.
you have to compensate for what's missing from your one hand. Either that or you control with your foot, but then you have one foot on the sustain. And if you have to move around to play a phrase or a long line or something like that, then your feet get all crazy. You can't just like move about how you normally do. Usually your feet are kind of stuck where they are,
Mhm.
one on the sustain and one on whatever pedal you're adjusting. I don't know if it's a wah pedal or expression pedal of any sorts. And for me, also as a small person, that's really difficult because I need to be able to move around the instrument. I can't just stand in the middle and easily hit that high F, like it's literally so far from my field of vision because I'm that
Mhm.
tall.
Yeah.
So that's why I actually resorted mostly to hand control and looping and stuff like that, because that's a way to free up my hands
Mhm.
and not control my feet. But at the same time, it's part of just getting used to using pedals with the instrument. It is a challenge. So, you're going to have challenges with it and you kind of have to make it work either
Yeah.
way. But
Yeah,
yeah.
I really appreciate like the music software and all these different things we've used to find so much human expression and access through technology gives me some hope because I feel like all these more like new technologies these days are like AI written music and these algorithms that recommend the same 8 songs to everyone. And it
Yeah.
like takes away that excitement about technology for me. But then hearing people talk about how they use pedals to like find their voice and things gives me hope that we actually can use technology for in like a humane way.
Yeah, I don't I you know, technology is our friend, but I think it doesn't always present itself that way, and
Hmm.
I think it's about how you use it.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think as a means to or emphasize, your own voice, or as a way of not using it as a crutch, but using it as an extension really, or something like that.
Hmm.
Um or as a way to expand sonic possibilities. I think then that kind of thing, you know, is really cool.
So I'd love to talk to you about like what your life has been like since you put out the open letter, which is where I first heard of you. And I'm curious, like, I mean, you were 19 at the time, and especially the music we play is so centered around mentorship and ancestors and elders. And there's a very specific kind of lineage there. And because of that, there's sometimes just like a blind admiration for great players or whoever has put the time in and is at the top. And it must have been, or maybe not, like how nervous were you to put that out because you know you're challenging that and you're like just a young student at the time and knowing that that could really affect your career.
Yeah, I was super nervous. And I wrote it when I was 18, and I didn't release it for like 8 months. I
Okay,
remember
yeah.
when it first came out, and I was commenting on the Ethan Iverson the interview.
Hmm.
And I remember when it came out, people were like, "But that interview was kind of from a while ago, wasn't it?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I mean, I wrote it a while ago, and I didn't publish it for a long time."
Yeah.
And after I went to the Banff International Workshop in Jazz and Creative Music, which is co-run by Vijay Iyer and Taishan Sori, um, there were a lot of amazing women mentors who were there. they're to teach. So Jen Shu and Tia Fuller and Ah Kyung Lee and a bunch of amazing, women artists. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember when Tia was gonna give her master class, that she instead wanted to take it as an opportunity to talk about sexism in the industry.
Mm.
And I thought that was really powerful because Tia is such a good player, and I look up to her immensely, not just, because she has worked with Beyonce or whoever, but because I think her language is super strong on the instrument. Her voice is strong. She's, confident. She's nice. She's, killing it, in every sense of the game.
Yeah.
And, to have her be like, we need to talk about this was a lot. And then there were a lot of my peers, whether it came from the mentors or the students themselves at that program, who came out about personal stories of harassment, of undermining, um, and seeing just how it's like pretty much every girl had a story there. And that was like, this is bigger than me and my pride. It's,
Mm-hmm.
something that I want to talk about, because it's not just about me anymore. It's about a bunch of people. And I remember after I published the letter, that I had a bunch of other girls reach out to me and say, thank you for saying what I was too afraid to say. And that was really the intention, not to speak for them, but to say, I'm certainly not the only one. And, this is not a unique experience. And, that this is not just, for me and my issues, but for tons of women who have been through the same process. And I
Mm-hmm.
think I just had this overwhelming feeling that, like, I didn't want this to be the future of jazz education. I didn't want someone to go through the stuff that I did. And especially when it comes to, manipulation, sexual harassment, and coercion, and that kind of thing. Like, I really, that stuff should be unacceptable and not tolerable. And you'd be surprised how many institutions are still hiring, people who have been sexually predatory towards their students.
Mm-hmm.
Not just towards women, could be towards men as well. Like,
Yeah.
um, yeah, and it was sort of like it was bigger than me, and I think that's what pushed me over the edge to finally publish it. And I
Mm-hmm.
had no idea, it was going to get the attention that it did. I mean, my only intention was just to write about my experience, and hopefully, I resonate with some people. I, get the conversation going or whatever. And I had no idea that it was going to become, what it did.
Yeah.
And uh, now it's interesting because it's been so long since I wrote it, or at least it feels like it's been so long. And I feel like so much has changed in my life, so it kind of feels like it was a different person.
Well, I mean,
I
it's funny. Yeah. An undergrad degree, you are a way different person at the end of it. Like, it does feel like
Sure.
forever. Like,
Yeah.
uh, 100%. I understand that, but
Yeah, I mean, it's still, of course, it's a part of who I am, and I do talk about these issues still.
mm-hmm.
And I've been asked to talk about these issues in front of other panels or other programs, things like that. I'm really happy to talk about it. I do want to be um, I would love to be a role model. I would love to, help other women feel stronger in their situations, stuff like that. I want to be a resource. I want to be a a beacon of strength. But at
Mm-hmm.
the same time, I think now my activism has sort of toned down. And it's not to say that I don't care about the issues, as much anymore. And absolutely, I still talk about it, on social media. I still write about it. I've mentioned it at shows, concerts, that kind of thing, or on panels.
Mm-hmm.
But I think now I'm just more preoccupied with the music
Yeah.
speaking for itself. And I think I got kind of sick of people asking me about the article all the time instead of asking me about my music.
Yeah.
Because it's like, hey, I'm a musician. I'm not, an opportunity for you to, um, get more views on your website or your newspaper because you have a catchy headline saying, oh, sexism in jazz is coming to a head, like that kind of thing. I wanted people to be like, this isn't an opportunity for you to sell your journalism. Like, I am also a musician. I create music, I write music, and I want you to, not, just write about, when you interview me, I want you to ask me, about my work. I don't want you to
Hmm.
just ask me about, this letter. And
Yeah.
I think for a while, I think I even had one or two publications where I was like, I don't want to talk about the letter actually, because I felt sick of it. I felt like it was overshining like my actual work.
Hmm.
And that wasn't my intention at all. I didn't want that to be the thing that I became known for.
Yeah.
So I think, for a while I was kind of pushing it away. And now, people still ask me about it. I still do talk about it. It's something, that I still stand by 100%. But I am, really stressing the music itself more and trying to let that speak for itself. Um,
For sure.
and yeah,
Well, I think that's unfair that, like, because you were, especially at the time, one of the few voices that I knew of who were standing up about it, that just became like what people were going to decide to label you as. And
yeah,
that's just another like unfair situation that you find yourself in as like trying to play this music as a woman. Um,
yeah, it's very true.
I'm Yeah, I guess my questions aren't necessarily about the letter itself, but more like, do you think there have been positive changes in the years that have followed since you put it out?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think a lot of teachers have been, more aware. I know that the new school started implementing, um, racism, sexism training, or, to step away from microaggressions or terms or things that are, you know, not maybe not current, or, certain things that maybe you could say that 10 years ago, but now, like, it's not okay. And
Mhm.
to be aware of why that is, why this microaggression is actually harmful, even if you didn't intend it to be, even if you didn't realize it, that kind of thing. um, I know that the new school made that a requirement for all of the faculty, so that was cool. And I think a lot of these, panels and discussions have started happening more, not only at schools but at festivals. I remember the year that I published the letter, that Winter Jazz Fest had a panel talking about this with Terry Lynn Carrington and Esperanza Spalding, Angela Davis. And to see, these women, these like, absolute uh, legends of the industry, talk about how they still have to deal with sexism, was like, wow, it really never, it's like it never ends. I
Yeah.
don't know. Like, these are some of the most brilliant people I know, women, man, whatever. Like, these are people who I've looked up to my whole life. And to hear them like talk about this stuff and how much it has affected them was like really crazy to me. It's like, oh, it's not just because I'm a student and I'm still learning. It's like, no, people who are true masters of the music can still experience this kind of thing, and that's how deep it runs. Um, but yeah, no, I think people have these discussions a lot more readily now. And um, people are holding more people accountable. People are speaking up more when they see, instances of sexism, instead of just kind of being like, oh, well, that was weird, or that wasn't right, but like not saying anything about it.
Mhm.
um, yeah, but I mean, I always think that there's more work to be done. I know that in recent years, a lot of festivals have been called out for their lack of female representation, and certainly there are enough of amazing, women jazz artists that, you know, that kind of thing shouldn't happen. So I'm glad that, a lot of those festivals have been called out, and some of them pledged to have 50% women band leaders, or 50%, you know, uh, women in their bands, that kind of thing, which I think is really cool. I know like the Stanford Jazz Workshop, where I used to go as a kid, now pledges to have 50% women faculty and 50% men.
Oh, that's
And
awesome.
that's awesome. Yeah. I don't think I had seen a music program do that before.
Mhm.
That was really cool.
Yeah. So I'm really interested in like discussing solutions on the show. And do you think so? Like just having conversations about this seems to still be so important because, like you said, you don't realize as a student yourself that this isn't just because you're a student. This is something that even the most accomplished and respected women in the field are dealing with.
Yeah.
Um, how important do you think it is to just keep having these conversations? And then, like, is that enough? What other solutions do you have in mind that should be implemented that could help the situation that maybe aren't being done as much as you think they should be?
I mean, I just think accountability is huge, and I think people don't do that enough. Like, people hear these stories of like, oh, this guy like did this kind of weird thing to this other girl, or like, oh, he had this student and he was coming on to her, and it was, she didn't want it and it was inappropriate or something like that, and yet those people continued to be hired. And it's not even that, like, I want to believe in everyone's capacity to change and
Hmm.
to be better. I'm not a huge fan of cancel culture unless it's like, something truly, you know, disgusting or abominable. But yeah, I like to believe that, everyone has the capacity to change. You should give it, most people the benefit of the doubt. And it's like schools wouldn't even have conversations with these teachers about what they did.
Mm.
It's like you just continue, you're kind of like, oh, I heard about that, but then nothing is done. And I'm
Yeah.
not saying that like all those professors need to be fired necessarily, but the school could sit down and talk with them and be like, listen, like, you can't do this. If you're going to continue to work here, you have to treat, the women students with respect. You cannot act, you can't come on to them or ask them on a date, or you can't touch their body without them sort of, without their permission, or
Hmm.
just think that like you have permission to do that when you don't. That's sort of like awareness.
Yeah. And
um
I know is like most people I know my age just kind of grew up where like, oh, that's just like more standard what you're supposed to do. But
yeah,
you, it is easy to forget that so many of these older professors grew up in this lineage mentorship cycle where they just were learned for decades that that's what you're supposed to do. And they're
yeah,
like, so many of them are well-meaning people who are just really out of touch. And just,
exactly,
yeah,
yeah,
having an authority figure say, listen, like this is completely unacceptable. You need to know
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. And I think that's a huge thing. There are certain things that passed in cultures, or not cultures, in society, 10, 20, 30 years ago, but now it's like, no, we have no tolerance for that. It's not just
Hmm.
how it is. Like, it's not just, oh, that's the kind of stuff you have to go through. And I've had a couple of like women jazz musicians say stuff like that, where they'll just be like, oh, you just kind of have to grin and bear it, or you kind of have to deal with it. You kind of have to put up with it. It's, I put up with it, so you should too, grow a tougher skin. And it's like, no, we shouldn't have to tolerate that. Like, I don't,
Yeah. Hmm.
not just because you had to doesn't mean the rest of us have to. It's not like a spiteful thing. It's like just genuine respect. I
Yeah.
don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Hmm.
But yeah, no, I mean, a lot of things, people have good intentions and are good people. Most people, don't want to intentionally be bad people,
Hmm.
like, most people are willing to get better, and most people are willing to, you know most people don't want to make people uncomfortable, you know what I mean?
Right.
So I think there's such a stress on like just conversations and sitting down with these teachers and working through with them, or being like, if you're going to continue working here, you have to understand that these kinds of things are not okay anymore. You can't
Hmm.
say these kinds of things. You can't do these kinds of things. It's not appropriate. And maybe it worked for you in the past, but we can't do that anymore, and to explain why, and,
Yeah.
you know, sit down and have that conversation with them.
Yeah. I
Um,
think that's
I
awesome.
think that's huge.
Yeah. I hadn't really thought of it that way before, but I think that's great. I
Yeah.
just have one more question. It's actually a listener question from
Okay.
my friend Hannah Johnson, who's a big
Okay.
fan of the show and of yours. And she said, so there were women who responded to your open letter with comments like, this doesn't help us because it makes us look like we're asking for sympathy. She wants to know, what would your response be to those people who say women choose to victimize themselves?
I mean, I just think that's not true. There are a lot of things, that are a normal part of education. I'm not complaining about every little thing. Like,
This isn't
again,
a
like
little thing. This is a
that
big thing.
first, yeah, that first lesson with Stefan, like he totally tore me apart. I was heartbroken, but it's part of the learning process. And, I think it's one thing if you are to complain about every little part of the process in a way that, you're saying like, oh, this actually doesn't have to do with sexism. It's a projection of you not wanting to learn or grow as a musician, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
But I think, you know, I never understood the like victimizing thing. It's like maybe you're just asking for general respect and accountability. And I don't know why speaking up against the issues has to mean that you're victimizing yourself. Like I think that's like an excuse for just letting things exist as they are. I don't I don't really think that that's okay.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that that seems like internalized sexism to me.
Mm.
Um, you know, I get the sentiment of, sometimes, yeah, you have to be strong. You can't complain about everything all the time. You can't change everything all the time. You certainly can't, but you can change some things, and you should if you can have the conversations, if you have the capacity to have the conversations and do the work, you should. I mean, and it's all of our responsibility to make the community a safer and a better and more enjoyable place where people feel like they're respected. There's nothing wrong with that. That's not victimization. I think that's just general respect. And I don't remember actually getting a lot of responses like that from women. So it's interesting
Mm.
that she brought that up. But I did get a couple, and certainly I got some from some uh, you know, women musicians on the jazz scene. And again, like I said, where like maybe that's what they had to do. They had to grin and bear it, and maybe that's why they make the point about like, oh, you're making yourself a victim. But it's like, no, we don't want to put up with it anymore.
Yeah.
Just because you had to do that doesn't mean that the rest of us do now. So to me, that seems like a little bit of a weird thing. I would hope that these musicians would want, future female students to not have to go through the same things that they've been through. But then there seems to be some ego thing of like, oh, well, I had to do all of these things to get where I am. So you should too. Why do you get a pass out of this scenario? It's like,
Hmm.
no, it's not like that. It's not, you don't, just get gigs for being a woman. Like you have to be able to know how to play and deliver a good show. And, that like, you can't just use, I'm a woman as a pass for
Hmm.
everything. Like,
Yeah,
that's not how that works.
for
Trust
sure.
me. It's a lot of venues, their objective is to sell tickets. And if you can't do that because you can't play, you can't deliver, then it doesn't matter, who you are or what you look like. You
Hmm.
you can't, get the gig, you can't play the gig. So,
Yeah, for sure.
I kind of think that that's bull crap. I won't swear on the show,
Oh, you
but
can. That's okay. But
it's bullshit.
well, yeah,
Yeah.
it's certainly like even just saying that, not to take away from what you had to go through and the strength that you showed to overcome these obstacles, but how great would it be if we could get rid of the obstacles entirely? I think that's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, thanks so
And
much
I think
for. Oh yeah, no, you got more? Go
oh,
for it.
sorry, I didn't mean to
No,
cut you
go
off.
for
I
it.
was just gonna say, it's hard enough to talk about the issues themselves, and then to like come out about these these often like traumatizing or deeply personal experiences. I mean, I think some of the stuff I've had to deal with, like, still influences me today, still impacts my confidence, that kind of
Mm,
thing. Like that stuff really stays with you. And I don't, to come out about it and to speak up about it is not just easy. It's not just like it's really like emotionally taxing. It's hard to talk about. This is
mm.
not just a walk in the park.
Yeah.
These are deeply personal subjects, and to dismiss it as like victimization or you know asking for a handout or something like that is just rude to me. It just seems like you don't understand the weight of the situation and how
Mm,
much it actually takes to even speak out about things. to know that you're going to get controversy and you're going to get backlash and you're going to get people who don't agree with you. And to still come out and say it that's hard. So,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, I certainly think many of the women I know who are musicians like have been emboldened by you sharing your words. So I certainly think it was worth it. And I appreciate you taking the time and like being vulnerable enough to talk about it here on the show. So
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for allowing the space for it to
for
exist.
sure. Before we're done, are there any things you're working on or places online that you want listeners to know about that you want to send them to? You're welcome to let them know.
Sure. My website is sashaberlinermusic.com. You can find videos, audio recordings, whatever on there. I am in the process of creating my second album, so I am recording in about a week and a half. I'm super excited. It's coming out on JMI Recordings. The band is great. Marcus Gilmore, Bernice Earl Travis III, James Francis, Jaleel Shaw, Nicholas Semrad, and Sharda Shashadar, and myself. Yeah. So I'm super excited about that. That's really what I've been working on for the past 2 months. And I do have a live stream show at Smalls with Palladium, the Wayne Shorter Tribute Project, on Christmas Eve. And you can tune into the live stream, or if you're in New York, there is limited seating. Get tested first, make sure you don't have COVID. But, bring your mask, your hand sanitizer. You can sit 6 feet apart, and I think there's maybe 15 or so seats. So you can come into Smalls if you're in New York, buy a ticket for that show. I will be playing 2 sets probably. So
sweet. Well, awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
That does it for this episode of the Happy Musicians Podcast. The featured tracks, this one is The Spotless Mind, and the other one was San Francisco. Those are off of Sasha's latest release, Azalea, and the whole album is incredible. I definitely encourage you to purchase it and check it out. You can find links to that and some other highlights from her discography that I've put up on thehappymusicians.com under her podcast post. There's also a blog. I have a category section where I've broken down all the episodes so that you can best find the podcast episode that's right for you right now. And again, there's a merch store now. And if you do buy something, I'm super grateful, and I hope that you'll take a photo in it and tag us on social media. We'll feature you in our story, and it'll totally make my day. If you're getting value out of these episodes, you can help grow the podcast and reach more people in a number of ways, and most of them are free. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please rate and review the show. It's super quick and easy, and for whatever magical algorithm purpose is incredibly beneficial for the show. You can just send it to a friend in a text. Say, hey, I'm getting something out of this, and I think you will too. And you can follow us on social media and share our posts. That's all I got. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you got something out of it. And until next episode, stay happy.